The Katana, either loved or hated, and you'll find almost nobody in between. Hi, I'm Nick Thomas and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing. So anybody that's familiar with this channel knows that we often post up sparring videos showing katanas, usually against European swords of various different kinds. And why would we do this? So some people would assume that we do it to try and show supremacy of European swords over Japanese swords. That is utterly nonsense. So if you look at our videos showing the katana, the person using the katana and the person using the European sword varies massively from one video to another. So you might have roughly equal skill between the two fighters, and you might have a mismatch, because ultimately those sparring clips, they're not designed to prove anything. They're just kind of exhibition. So you might have different quality of fighters, and some weapons do inherently have an advantage against other weapons in specific scenarios and specific contexts. So you might see a sparring clip where the katana does really well, and you might see one where it does really badly. And that's kind of hilarious because, as I said at the start of the video, the katana tends to have people who love it and hate it, and therefore they want to either worship it or kind of hate on it. And so people come onto the comments section on the videos where we show katanas, and they basically, it's a rubbish sword, or it's an amazing sword, or it's being used wrongly or rightly, or anything else. But ultimately, I'm going to look here at why we put it on the video and why it's kind of interesting. Because let me just start out and say, I never want to try and show that a particular sword like the katana is better or worse than any other sword, because that's completely fruitless and nonsense. Is because a sword is of its time and place in its own context, and there generally aren't many bad swords out there. As if a sword lasts any length of time, it has merit and is usually well suited to the particular time period and the context that it's being used in. And there's no doubt that the Japanese swords were very good in their time, very successful. And when Europeans encountered the Japanese, they actually had a lot of respect for the swords and the swordsmanship. They found them kind of curious, of course, because, well, for a start, it's a very short sword, especially for one that you put in two hands as a general rule. But yeah, they were very, very curious, but also had a lot of respect for the Japanese swords and swordsmanship. So when we put them in our videos, it's never to try and prove one is better than the other as a sword. But the one thing that we do is look at how one would do against another in a particular fight. So when you see our videos that are, say, saber versus katana, it's not to say which is the best sword, but how they would fare against one another in a fight. So I set up a scenario. It's usually one-on-one, unarmored. How would they do against one another? So if there's a versus video, it's usually, and it's a talking head like this, it's usually what I'm talking about there. It's not which is better at a specific task. That's pointless, utterly pointless. Or overall, which is a better sword. That's also pointless, because it's more important to actually establish where and how they're being used and by who, and where is it a civilian fight, battlefield, is there armor involved? Is it a melee? There's so many different contexts to understand as to try and establish which one is the best for that particular job. Or, is it a cutting test and then try and compare the two? I don't find that particularly interesting, because we know that sabers cut well, and we know katanas cut well. We know they were both used very successfully. So I don't particularly care about comparing them for the exact task at hand. But I'm very interested to see how they compare when fighting against each other, crossing blades. For me, that's the really interesting aspect. And if you look at any accounts of historical swordsmanship and historical combat, the thing you'll come across very often is that the two people fighting, or groups fighting, are often not matched in terms of weapons, equipment, style, even something as basic as saber versus bayonet, which is a common thing that a saber's going to have to deal with, or sword versus spear, or talwar versus saber. There's so many scenarios where it's not matched weapons, whereas today we so often think of swordsmanship as matched weapons. So you'll see kendo practitioners just practicing kendo with their shinai, or you'll see longsworders just doing longsword versus longsword, and the same with saber versus saber, which by default is a good thing, because that's the normal practice. That's how you learn the style of swordsmanship. But if you want to understand more about how the swords then got used kind of actually in combat, you need to look at them beyond matching the two weapons and two styles together, and compare them to other styles and other sword types. And so that, therefore, is the thing that interests me and our club most, is just not trying to establish, a dominant sword type or anything like that, but just how one fares against the other in a particular scenario. And over the years, we've had different training swords for the katana. We initially used the cold steel bokkens, which are basic, but they're tough. And then we had the Black Fencer synthetic, which is a big improvement because it handles better and it flexes a little bit. It's just a nice all-around weapon. And then we've got now these steel training swords, which are by Siggyforge, and they were developed alongside. So Siggyforge is a HEMA sword manufacturer. They mostly make feathers and that kind of thing. But yeah, they started making Japanese swords, and they've made them in collaboration with a Japanese sword school that have helped them develop swords that, handle, and they're not designed to look exactly like an antique. They're designed to be like a feather in HEMA. They functionally do the job of the sword whilst being safe. So it's blunt, it has flex, it has a swollen tip on it for thrusting. So it's designed to handle and feel relatively like a original katana and be suitable for high contact sparring. Now sadly, because of COVID, these arrived during all of the restrictions that we've had in place, and therefore we've only got to use these a couple of times. And there are maybe 2 videos of us testing these out. And actually we got the whole range. So this is the what you'd call O-katana, or basically big katana, as it would be in Japanese, for the O-bokken O-katana. This is the standard katana, and we've also got the wakizashi as well. So when we get back from the restrictions, you're going to see these used a lot, and it's going to be hilarious because we're going to be able to pitch them against every steel sword that we've got. So we're going to do loads more of that sparring. That's going to include things like longsword and rapier and saber and spadroon, maybe even small sword, all kinds of things up against these weapons. And for the first time, we'll be able to do steel on steel, which is going to be really fascinating. And the thing that is always funny with the katana is that people always come on the videos and say, well, that's not a katana, that's a wakizashi. They usually say about the Black Fencer or the cold steel ones, because people are influenced essentially by modern movies and games, and they think the katana is a lot bigger than it actually is. Now, the Japanese did have big swords, of course they did, but the thing that got called the katana as a general rule is very small. So small, in fact, that some Europeans called them a two-handed cutlass because they regarded them as that small. And that's actually kind of accurate because, the British cutlass is usually about 28 to 29 inch in blade length. That's a very common length for katanas. Yes, they were very short, especially for one that has a two-handed grip. So in this video, I'm not going to talk about the katana as a weapon. I've talked about it before. It was a successful weapon. There's nothing to really say about that. But yes, we're going to do loads more sparring clips because for me, one of the most fascinating things to study, to research and to practice is how different weapons and different styles basically encounter one another and how they work against one another, because you have so many people have so many ideas about how certain weapons are going to work against one another, and usually when it actually gets put into practice they are quite surprised. A good example would be the spear versus the sword. There's a general assumption that a sword would be dominant over the spear, which anybody that's done any practice with that knows is absolutely false. The spear is an incredible weapon, and particularly in two hands, a very, very nimble and agile one, owing to its both reach and massive leverage in two hands. Anyway, that's off topic. So why do we compare the katana and other Japanese swords to European swords? Well, simply because it's fascinating. Since gladiatorial times, people have compared, well, probably way before that, but for entertainment purposes anyway, as well as informative purposes, people have compared different swords and different styles to one another because it is interesting, it's informative, and it's fun. And ultimately, fun is a large part of why we do any of this. So yeah, why do we compare them? Because it's fun and it's interesting and it steps beyond just the matched weapons sparring scenario, which is fine, but there's so much more to research, understanding and fun to be had with swords and swordsmanship and other weapons. So there you have it. When we get back from these COVID restrictions, we will put these in a ton of videos. We will try and get some Japanese sword practitioners in. We've had a couple in the past. We'd like to have more, particularly Kenjutsu, although that's a problem because there aren't so many of them around and not that many of them do much sparring, so it's a little bit difficult, but I'd much rather have Kenjutsu than Kendo practitioners in. There are some Kendo people that do some of the more traditional martial art based stuff more than the more restricted sportive elements that you see in the rules of Kendo today. So we might be able to get some in, and I'd love to have that. If you can get to us and you are a Japanese sword practitioner, write in and we'll see what we can do, because that could be good fun. We've got synthetics and we've got steel, and we can have some fun matching those up. So there you have it. We compare them because it's fun and it's interesting. And if you have seen any of our videos, or even if you haven't, go and check a few more out, because we've already done quite a number of them and it is quite interesting. So there you go. Thanks for watching. We'll put a load more content up with these very soon. And please subscribe if you haven't already.